to do readings from 12 Rounds in Lowe's Gym, and I thought that was a great event. I thought he's got a great voice. So let me just do a bit of a standard introduction for Dr. Snyder, who's got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree here from our English department at Marshall University. So he's a proud son of Marshall. He went on to earn a PhD in rhetoric and composition from Ohio U, and subsequently took a position at Siena College and has been since 2011 a faculty member and now an associate professor at Siena College, doing great work up there and enjoying his time with his students and enjoying his family and his son named Huntington because he's still tied to Huntington. We got you on video talking about that at your last visit. He published several books. He published The Rhetoric of Appalachian Identity in 2014 and 12 Rounds in Lowe's Gym in 2018. And he's got his new book that we're going to work on and do some reading from and talk about today. Bundini, Don't Believe the Hype, just came out this year. Todd, if you know him, if you don't know him, he's a native of Cowan, West Virginia. And there's a lot of good prose about that in the 12 Rounds in Lowe's Gym, about his upbringing and where he came from and how he came. And Todd, the thing that I thought about when I was thinking about introducing Todd is that Todd sort of has an ordinary and extraordinary story. And the somewhat ordinary part of it is, he's a small town, West Virginia, Appalachian kid who grew up around people maybe who didn't have this big expectation of all these folks around him that you would just go to college and make something of yourself and become a professional. It's a little bit more of a blue collar existence. And most of the kids in high school didn't think, oh, I'm going to college, And, but like a lot of kids, the first generation college kids and so forth, and small town kids, they think, well, there's a world out there. He certainly got exposed to that from his dad and traveling around the state, I think, in boxing competitions and seeing how that was. And I thought, well, I remember you telling a story earlier, Todd, about how you got in there and trained with your dad, and then you got in a couple boxing matches and decided boxing's not for me. After you get, like Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. So I said, well, if you get punched in the mouth, your plan changes a little bit. So he came to college and maybe didn't have like most 18-year-olds, a fully fleshed out idea about what that was going to turn into and how his life was going to go. But came under the wing of some people who really saw his talent, right? I mean, up here in the university, professors kind of, figure out how to hand our students a flint. And they let them chip away at that flint until a spark comes and the spark turns into a flame. And that's what happened. That's certainly what happened to me and a lot of us. I think that's what happened to Todd. He started to see something, started to develop his own voice. He started to get a passion for something, to think he had something to say. And then the people that he was around, and particularly professors and mentors, fueled that, blew a little oxygen on it, let it turn into a flame until he could really start developing his talents and become something more than he imagined in the beginning, and take a path that maybe he didn't expect. And I think the extraordinary parts, that's not totally uncommon. That's kind of ordinary. People come and they don't quite know what they're going to become, and they get nurtured while they're here, and they find their way, and they take a path and they become successful. But maybe what's extraordinary about Todd is his talent. He's an extraordinary talent. He writes beautifully well. He has this fascinating, he's got this deep, profound interest in language. I think that's why you like hip hop. One of the reasons you like hip hop is really a language game. So Todd really learned to use language, as a tool and as a toy. On the one hand, it expresses ideas and it shares what you want to do. But on the other hand, you get to play with it and turn it around and look at things from different perspectives and really sort of inspire and delight people with the way you tell a story. And that's what I find extraordinary about you, Todd. So without going on too much more about that, I just want to turn it over to you and listen to what you have to say about your book and how those ideas developed, and do some reading from that. And as we talked about a little bit ago, it seems like it wouldn't be appropriate to sort of introduce it and turn it over without coming up with some kind of announcement. And let's get ready to rumble, the young man, rumble. We'll turn it over to Kid Cowan, the poetic pugilist, Dr. Todd Snyder. I'll let you take it away.
Kid Cowan, that's the first time anyone's ever called me that. Thank you, Dean Bookwalter. Wow, what an introduction. That was better than any boxing match I was ever a part of in my father's gym. Look, I feel like I have to begin today by thanking so many people who are responsible for my success at Marshall University. I want to thank Dean Bookwalter. I want to thank Dr. Kelly Prigine for all she's done for me in my career. I also want to acknowledge some other Marshall University professors who played a big part in my academic growth and helping me get where I needed to go in life. I want to thank Dr. Mary Moore, who was like my Marshall mother. She took care of me, shaped me as a writer, and helped me grow. And I wouldn't be where I'm at without Dr. Mary Moore. I want to thank Dr. Catherine Rodier, who she's no longer with us, but she's with us in spirit. Anytime I do something that's affiliated with Marshall University, I feel like I have to say her name because she was a big part of my success here. I want to thank Dr. Roxanne Kirkwood of Tanis, who was extremely helpful to me in graduate school. Dr. Michelle Schiavone, a fellow boxing fan who is an English professor at Marshall, and a lot of other folks too. As Dean Bookwalter mentioned, Marshall University is an extremely important place in my life. I was a first-generation college student who came to Marshall with no true sense of what I wanted to be in life other than a writer, and I had no clue how to get there. I remember my 6th grade teacher told me, I went to her and said that I wanted to be a writer when I grow up, and she said, well, you better be Stephen King, otherwise your children might starve. And there were a lot of people along the way who didn't give me, the kind of support that one would want as a young Appalachian kid from a coal mining town. But when I came to Marshall University, when I came to Huntington, I found that sense of community. And I found a collection of people who made me believe in myself. And the guy we're going to talk about today, Drew Bundini Brown, did that for the greatest fighter of all time, Muhammad Ali. So I have to thank my Bundinis in the English department for helping me believe in myself and hyping me up and making me feel like I was a great writer before I ever was. So I just wanted to begin that way. And as Dean Bookwalter mentioned, when I say I love Marshall University, I mean it. I named my son Huntington, so that tells you how much I love the place. My wife and I met there and fell in love. And Huntington, West Virginia is a very special place to us. It's home with a capital H. So let's start the talk tonight. I wish I could be in Huntington with you guys tonight, that's for sure. The new book is Bundini, Don't Believe the Hype. And it is the first ever biography of Muhammad Ali's trainer, Drew Bundini Brown. It's a name that if you're a boxing fan, you know who Bundini is, because he was the guy next to Muhammad Ali, helping him with those famous rhymes that Muhammad Ali would do at the weigh-ins and at press conferences and media opportunities. Of course, the most famous Bundini line is, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, your hands can't hit what your eyes can't see, rumble, young man, rumble. And Bundini was sort of the poet laureate of Muhammad Ali's corner. And for those of you who don't follow boxing, you typically have 3 or 4 trainers who sort of work you through a training camp. And the night of a big fight, you have 3 of those individuals come to the ring with you and work with you in between rounds. Muhammad Ali's head trainer was a guy named Angelo Dundee, but his hype man, his cheerleader, his confidant, his sidekick was Drew Bundini Brown. And it's exciting for me to get to tell this story. In so many ways, it feels like the book I was born to write. And this is just a piece of advice. If we have any young writers listening to this video, sometimes the book you were born to write is right there in front of your face, but it's a long path to get there, to the book you were born to write. So I want to begin today by talking about how I came to be Drew Bundini Brown's biographer. A white kid from Cowan, West Virginia, whose dad was a coal miner. was the one who wrote Bundini's life story, one of the most charismatic and famous boxing trainers in the history of the sport. So I want to talk about where that idea came from and what brought me to this project. To be honest, it began in Cowan. As Dr. Bookwalter alluded to earlier, my father was a small town boxing trainer. And when I say my father was a boxing trainer, sometimes people think some glorious, they have some glorious picture in their head. My father's boxing gym originally was in the back of my mother's beauty shop. My mother was a beautician. So the front of the shop was little old ladies with curlers in their hair, and the back of the shop was my dad's boxing ring and a bunch of tattooed, beer-bellied coal miners who he would teach how to fight, predominantly for the West Virginia Tough Man circuit. So I grew up around boxing my whole life. And because I grew up the son of a boxing trainer, I always viewed the sport through that particular lens. There were always guys coming around the trailer park wanting my dad to teach him how to fight. I spent a lot of my younger days, my latchkey kid days, in the gym watching guys hit the hand pads, spar, hit the heavy bag. So my sort of entry into boxing was via the life of a boxing trainer. So I understood even from a very young age what it meant to be a part of a training camp. I understood from a very young age what trainers did for boxers, right? Boxing is a solo sport, some people would tell you. But it takes a lot to get a fighter ready for a 12-round, 15-round professional fight. I mean, we're talking about 6 to 8 weeks training camp, and you have a team of people, each with a different role to get the fighter ready. So as the son of a boxing trainer, I would watch my dad take guys who didn't have a lot of talent and sort of coach them to wins. And it would always amaze me when he would do that kind of thing. He would have guys who had all the talent in the world and they would lose fights because they would lose the fight upstairs before they ever came into the ring. So I watched like the psychology of boxing as a young kid. It was something I picked up on in a very intuitive way. I watched my father hype guys up in the locker room before fights. I watched my father have to be a different type of teacher, a different type of rhetorician for each fighter. Because you can't yell and scream to every fighter. Some people shut down with that. You can't baby or sort of puff up everyone because some folks don't, respond to that kind of instruction. So as a young kid, I noticed that the trainer was an integral part of boxing. And as the son of a boxing trainer, I was always fascinated by, that dialogue in the corner. When I was in college at Marshall, I would come home in the summers and work at my dad's gym. And I've worked hundreds of amateur and professional boxing corners in my life. And I was always interested in that sort of 1 minute break in between rounds and what the trainer does to get the fighter ready to go back out there. Because getting punched in the face is something most of us try to avoid in our life, right? These guys go into it head first. So I was always interested in the psychology of the sport. So, in my dad's gym, his sidekick was a guy named Jeff Dean, who was one of our assistant trainers. My dad referred to him as Bundini Dean. And the reason he called him Bundini Dean was he was my father's sidekick. He would be at the first one at the gym, the last one to leave. And if there was ever a really difficult job to do or sort of thankless work that goes into boxing, Bundini Dean was there with us. Muhammad Ali was my dad's hero. And Ali was the guy who got him into boxing as a young man. My dad was very proud of the fact that Muhammad Ali was from Louisville, Kentucky. And my dad viewed Muhammad Ali as an Appalachian man. And he was very proud of the fact that Muhammad Ali's first pro opponent was a guy named Tony Hunsaker, who was a police chief in Fayetteville, West Virginia. And the Hunsaker family, they were family friends of ours. Pretty much anyone in West Virginia who was involved in boxing, my father knew them. So he was very proud of Ali being sort of a local boy to some degree. And Ali was his hero. And being an Ali fan during the 60s and during Ali's exile was not always easy growing up where my father grew up. So he got into a lot of playground scuffles of kids who didn't like Muhammad Ali. He was the most outspoken, charismatic Black athlete in the history of sports at that time, maybe ever, still today. And, his religious beliefs and his stance on the Vietnam War made him sort of a polarizing figure. But I grew up knowing Ali stood for his beliefs, and Ali was bigger than boxing. And my father loved Ali for the way he was outside the ring as much as he did, for what he could do for the sport inside the ring. So part of what brought me to this book was my dad was an Ali nut. I watched all those Ali fights as a kid. I watched all the documentaries. I grew up watching the Ali videos and those routines with Bundini, and I loved that part of Ali's persona, the rhymes. So, part of the reason I wanted to write this book was my dad was a trainer. The other reason that I wanted to write this book, and maybe even a bigger reason, to be honest, is that hip hop was my first love. Boxing was, something that transformed my father's life, but hip hop was something that transformed my life. I was a kid who grew up in the 80s, and I just fell in love with hip hop. To borrow a term from scholar Deborah Brandt, it was my literacy sponsor. Hip hop got me into poetry. It got me into, the first time I read Langston Hughes, it was because I heard his name referenced in a Nas song. So hip hop made me a scavenger of language and culture and sports and art. And, it made poetry a masculine thing. It made it cool. For a kid who was from a working class, sort of hyper masculine background, hip hop gave me a way to love to read and it still be cool. It still be okay. So, hip hop was my first love. And hip hop, writing about hip hop is something I always wanted to do. I would read those Source magazine, editions that would come out, and I'd read them cover to cover. And I wanted to be one of those writers who wrote about hip hop culture. One of the reasons my love of hip hop brought me to this book was this documentary called Ali Rap. And it came out in, I think, 2006. And it was produced by ESPN. And the narrator of the documentary was Chuck D of Public Enemy. If you know the famous Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees, Public Enemy, Chuck D was the frontman of that group. And in the documentary, Chuck D makes the argument that Ali was the first rapper, and that it was Muhammad Ali who created the rhetorical archetype for hip hop. That Muhammad Ali's his bravado, his poetics, his his flashiness, his swagger, whatever you want to call it, was sort of the formula for hip hop a couple of decades later. So I'm the son of a boxing trainer who grew up loving hip hop. And part of what I loved about Ali were those rhymes. The way he would play with language, as Dr. Bookwalter said, the way he would taunt his opponents with rhymes about them. He would create these poems about what was going to happen in the fight. He famously said he was going to hit Frazier with an uppercut that turned him into a human satellite. He had all these great rhymes. Well, one of the reasons I'm fascinated in Bundini was he was the guy who penned those rhymes. He was the guy who was sort of the poet in Ali's corner, who came up with, as I said earlier, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. So it was very interesting to me that there was sort of this rap pre-hip hop icon who, when he joined Ali's entourage, sort of took the champ and his hip hop ethos to a new level. So fast forward a few years, when I get my job at Siena College in Albany, New York, I started teaching hip hop rhetoric courses. And I would always show that Ali Rap documentary because I felt like they needed to know that hip hop wasn't born in a vacuum, that it came from somewhere. And, we would always talk about Chuck D, and we would talk about hip hop and Bundini and Ali. And luckily, we formed this thing at my college called Siena College Hip Hop Week. It's a week-long celebration of the culture. And the second year we ran that program, we were able to get the funds together to get Chuck D to come to Siena College and be our keynote speaker. So Chuck D comes to give his lecture to my students. And my students had watched his documentary, Ali Rap. So before he does his talk to the public, he has dinner with my students in our dining hall in Siena College. And I'm having dinner with Chuck D, one of my icons, the guy I grew up idolizing as a kid. And the subject of Ali came up. One of my students asked him, was float like a butterfly, sting like a bee the first rap lyric? And Chuck laughed and he said, sure, yeah, I think you could make the argument Ali's the first rapper. And I piped in because I'm a Bundini fan. And I said, well, hold up, Bundini came up with that rhyme. Does that mean Bundini is the first hype man? And I was sort of alluding to Flavor Flav of Public Enemy, who was Chuck D's hype man. And he looked at me dead in my eyes, and I'll never forget it. Chuck D said, someone should write a book on Bundini. And that was 2014. And I started saying to myself, Chuck's got a point. Anytime you watch an Ali documentary, or anytime you read an Ali book, there's always a little tiny paragraph about Bundini. And his life was sort of mysterious. He was this guy who, he was with Muhammad Ali for, I think, 44 fights. But he was always sort of there, sort of in the background. He was this enigmatic, shadowy figure who was the loudest voice in Muhammad Ali's corner. But a lot of folks didn't know how he ended up in that illustrious seat of being Muhammad Ali's assistant trainer. So ever since I had that conversation with Chuck D, the idea was in my head that, wow, what a book that would be. What would it like to be the guy who motivates a savant? What would it be like to be the guy who motivates someone who isn't just called the greatest, but is called the greatest of all time, right? And so that idea was there for me. I never started, it wasn't like I had the conversation with Chuck D and then started writing the book the next day, but the idea was sort of there, that that's a book I thought I could write. Fast forward a couple more years, and Hamilcar Publications, my publisher for this book, they're a publisher out of Boston that specializes in boxing, true crime, and they do some hip hop stuff too. They have a blog on their website, and they posted a blog that was written by Kyle Serafine, one of the principal publishers, about Bundini being the greatest hype man in the history of boxing, which hype man is a term that comes out of hip hop. And the blog received a lot of traffic. So those guys at Hamilcar kind of put their heads together and said, we need to find someone to write this book. This is a book that needs to be written. And they started searching the internet for writers who know boxing and hip hop. And I came up, pictures of me and Chuck D hanging out at Siena College. Because I'd written a little bit about boxing. I'd written a little bit about hip hop. And Kyle reached out to me and said, hey, we found you online. We read your book. We liked it. We wondered if you'd be interested in this. And as I'm on the phone talking to Kyle about this, I'm looking at my office in Siena College, and above my desk at Siena is a picture of Ali and Bundini. And, you know, it just felt like this was the book that I was meant to write, that all these sort of forces in the universe had sort of put me in this direction to write this book. Bundini referred to God as Shorty. That was his nickname for God. He would say, Shorty looks out for the little guy. And that was his sort of his nickname for the higher power. So in some ways, it did kind of feel like a Shorty moment when they called me and asked me if I was interested. And this is how much of a humble Appalachian kid I am. When they called to talk to me about the book, I thought they wanted me to review it. Because, you know, I do a lot of that where you review books for journals and you know, publishers. I didn't think they wanted me to write it. I thought they wanted me to review it. And then pretty soon, early in the conversation, I realized they were pegging me to write this book. So they linked me up with Bundini's son, Drew Brown III. And we established a little relationship talking over the phone. And pretty soon I realized this is a story that's never been told, and that his son had connections with folks who could really help me put a flashlight on a very dark corner in boxing history and sort of tell some stories that have been missed, some research gaps, as we would say in my field, in the history of boxing. So that's what brought me to this journey. And boy, it has been the most amazing journey in my writing life, guys. I got to interview Big George Foreman. I got to interview Muhammad Ali's wife. I got to interview Larry Holmes, Tim Witherspoon, Ernie Schaefer's, all of these legendary boxing names. All of Ali's biographers, I was able to talk to them. I was talk to the Brown family. Really got to know Bundini as a family man, as a father, as a son, outside of his role as being Muhammad Ali's personal trainer. And early on, I knew this was going to be a wild ride. So Dr. Bookwalter had asked me to read a little bit for you guys tonight. So I thought I would read the beginning of the book. It was sort of the first day that my research really took off. You know, Drew and I, Bundini's son, had a couple conversations on the phone. And we would record conversations, and we were kind of putting a timeline together of his father's life. But early on, he said, you have to come down to Atlanta and see what I have down here. You know, I have my father's jewelry, I have his diaries, I have his poetry, I have photo albums and scrapbooks. I have, you know, postcards from Muhammad Ali, postcards from my father, letters from my mother to my father, all this stuff that would be, you know, dynamite for writing this book. So I decided to fly to Atlanta, having never met Bundini's son in my life. And the opening scene in my book is Drew Brown III picking me up from the airport as we went on this crazy little journey to sort of discover who Bundini Brown was. So I'm just going to read the opening scene of the book. And the reason I want to read that opening scene is books kind of write themselves. And often you have no idea where it's going to take you, right? As I flew down to Atlanta to meet Bundini's son, I didn't have a clue what I was getting myself into. This scene, the opening of the book, outlines what happened when he picked me up from the airport in Atlanta. So So I'm just going to read a couple pages for you guys. The white Rolls Royce weaved out of the slow-moving airport traffic and came to a rolling stop. The suicide doors opened, providing a sneak peek of the interior. He was tall, thin, handsome, and gangly like his father. Drew Timothy Brown III, Drew Bundini Brown's son, smiled and brushed his right hand through his hair, briefly fingering the bald patch. If you know anything about Bundini, he had this famous bald patch right in the middle of his head, and his son has it too. We used to think that Daddy's hair fell out because of the chemicals he put in it, back when the conch was a thing, Drew said to me, lifting the carry-on bag from my shoulder as if he were a chauffeur. Now we know it's genetic. Looks just like his, doesn't it? He added. I climbed into the luxury vehicle awkwardly. The car doors shut themselves. Drew's resemblance to his father was uncanny. I instantly noticed he was wearing his father's jewelry, the famous Star of David necklace, a gold watch, a diamond-encrusted bracelet bearing the family name. Drew had grown his hair out for me, I suspected. This was his way of introducing me to his father. I didn't anticipate getting scooped up in a double R, I said, half jokingly, attempting to stave off the kind of silence that often lingers between strangers thrust into close proximity. After the first Ali Frazier fight, my father brought a brand spanking new Fleetwood Brougham Cadillac. He named the car Black Beauty. Daddy named all of his cars. But this one was the bomb. Black with gray interior. It had a psychedelic lighting in the rear passenger section. It had the disco package, they called it. The lights would go on with the music. Daddy loved that car, Drew responded, suggesting my statement had triggered a memory. The white Rolls-Royce exited Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport and made its way onto I-85 South. Let me tell you a story about that car, Drew continued. Moments into our time together, we became old friends. Drew's enthusiasm for his own story was infectious. When I received my driver's license, I was looking for one of those Brady Bunch moments. So I asked Daddy, when he came to visit, if I could drive Black Beauty, Drew continued. No, boy, you don't get to drive this car. You didn't work for this. You got to work hard. You got to do something great to drive a car like this. I'm not going to let you drive around in this car acting like you did something big, Bundini scolded his son. Listening to Drew relive the memory, seated in the passenger seat of his Rolls Royce, I was suddenly reminded of the fact I was in the presence of Drew Timothy Brown III, not Bundini. I'd never been more upset in my entire life. I just wanted a Brady Bunch moment, father knows best type of moment. Dad, can I borrow the car? That type of thing. I would have just taken the car around the dang block, Drew said. Is this a painful memory for you? I asked, sensing my research was now officially underway. To this, Drew flashed a grin. Fast forward a few years, after I graduated college, when I was working in Las Vegas, I bought this beautiful red Cadillac. I remember picking Daddy up from the airport. He said, "Dang, son, this is nice. Let me drive it," Drew continued. I guessed the crescendo of the parable long before the words left his lips. In telling the Black Beauty story, Drew had given me my first lesson on Bundini. I told Daddy, hell no, this is my ride. You got to do something great to drive a car like this. And you wouldn't believe it. The biggest smile you've ever seen crossed Daddy's face, Drew said, chuckling as he delivered the punchline. I didn't understand what he was trying to tell me before. But at that moment, it felt so wonderful. Daddy was proud. And in the end, I was proud of myself. And Daddy was absolutely right, he added. Drew Brown III has, without question, achieved greatness in his own life. He was a college basketball star, earning a full athletic scholarship to Southern University of New Orleans. After becoming the first member of his family to graduate from college, earning a degree in business and a minor in economics, Drew later joined the U.S. Navy, earning the Wings of Gold in 1983. Early into his career, Drew was assigned to Attack Squadron 35, known as the Black Panthers, the oldest attack squadron in naval aviation history. Because the young pilot was known around the squadron for being tall, dark, and handsome, Drew stands 6'5", he was given the call sign Dark Gable. At the time, Drew was the only Black Navy jet pilot flying the A-6 Intruder attack aircraft on the East Coast. His would be an illustrious naval career. He was awarded the Meritorious Service Medal by the President of the United States, the Freedom Foundation Medal by the U.S. Supreme Court, the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Male Achievement Award, as well as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Special Salute for Outstanding Leadership. After his career came to an end, Drew was hired as an airline pilot for FedEx, a career that would span 3 decades. While Drew spent much of his adult life above the clouds, it would be on the ground, in front of junior high and high school students, that the former Navy pilot would make his biggest impact. In 1991, Drew Timothy Brown III published a best-selling book titled You Gotta Believe, which launched his career as a motivational speaker. After the book was released, Drew appeared on NBC's Today Show, NBC Nightly News, CBS This Morning, and hundreds of local radio and television programs. His work would also be featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Fortune magazine. At the height of his popularity, Drew was interviewed by media luminaries such as Jane Pauley, Phil Donahue, and Connie Chung. When it came to rhetoric, the apple did not fall far from the family tree. Drew is much like his father. He is a fast talker, and he has a vocal presence that's quite commanding. Bundini's son is the person you should be writing that book about. He was an extraordinary young man. He made a path for himself. Gene Kilroy, Muhammad Ali's longtime business manager, said to me over the phone just days prior to my visit to Atlanta. Drew Brown III's home was breathtaking. It was the most beautiful home I'd ever seen. We entered the property via cast iron gates, griffins perched on each side of the entrance, a double B insignia prominently featured on each side of the dual swing driveway doors. Much different than the trailer park I grew up in Cowan. Drew's multi-story home featured a gym, a small movie theater, and a man-made lake in the backyard. Each room was handsomely furnished, adorned with antiques and artifacts from around the world. Regarding the decor, there were plenty of visual cues calling back to Drew's days in the Navy, but little to no evidence of his life around boxing. I'd be embarrassed to show this place off if my father had left this to me, if I hadn't earned it, Drew insisted, petting Bo, one of his 6 Great Danes, animals who were in every way as impressive as his own home. In suggesting he had earned his fortune, Drew Brown III was not being disingenuous. When Bundini died in September of 1987, he left his son absolutely nothing in terms of money. Drew's father died penniless in a modest hotel room located in a crime-ridden section of Los Angeles. His mother, Rhoda Palestine, was no better with finances than her mercurial husband. Drew and his mother spent much of his childhood living in the Carver Housing Authority projects in Spanish Harlem. My host, despite all of his impressive material possessions, was hardly of blue blood lineage. His wealth had nothing to do with trust funds or celebrity privilege. My father's life ended in misery, like my mother's, because in the end, they didn't plan for the future. They lived in the now. If you gave my father money, he either gave it away or spent it. One of the reasons I'm successful is because I watched my parents struggle, Drew said to me as we made our way around the property. It was on the final leg of the tour that I found the opening to my story. As we made our way into Drew's private library, the photographs lining his bookshelves all but jumped into my hands. There were images of Drew and his father palling around with the likes of Sugar Ray Robinson, Muhammad Ali, Colin Powell, and even Liberace. It's quite a picture. Drew showed little energy when rehashing celebrity encounters. He showed even less interest in talking boxing. When describing the personalities of his family members, however, Drew came to life. His verbal and physical enthusiasm noticeably changed. I'm not biracial, Todd, Drew corrected me. There's one race, the human race. I'm bicultural, he insisted. The diversity found within the frozen images lining his library bookshelves was nothing short of spectacular. Each photograph contained visual representations of seemingly disparate worlds in harmony. Growing up, I never once thought of myself as less than, Drew assured me, providing a hard pause after that declaration. My parents, if anything, taught me that I was better. I had the black side and I had the Jewish side. I had the best of both worlds, Drew added, handing over, one by one, my cast of characters. To tell my father's story, to really understand his life, you got to go back to the beginning, Drew III insisted, removing one last framed photograph from the top shelf. To really get the story right, you got to take it back to Sanford, Florida, he added. So at that point in my research process, I realized that I'd stumbled on some pretty amazing stuff. And I knew I wanted to open my book with that scene because with a book about Drew Bundini Brown, it's got to be funky. It's got to have energy. It's got to have stories and characters because he was one of the biggest characters in the history of boxing. So he took me back to Sanford. And, you know, Bundini was born at a time where Sanford, Florida was a tough place to live if you were a black man. The KKK loomed large in Seminole County. Most of Bundini's family were sharecroppers working the citrus groves or working in the celery fields. His father was an alcoholic. His father was abusive. And his mother abandoned him as a result of that abuse when he was just in the second grade. Bundini never was given a formal education. So in Sanford, Florida, he sort of lived as a shoe shine boy, walking down to downtown Sanford and shining the shoes of the naval officers in the nearby station. Eventually, when he's a teenager, he signs up for the Navy when he's not even 18 years old. He lies about his age. He's a tall kid. Bundini was 6'4" as well, same height as Muhammad Ali. And he joins the Navy as a naval steward. And in that time, there was a lot of racism in the Navy as well. So as a naval steward, he shines shoes, cooks in the kitchen, and serves the officers. But that journey takes Bundini around the world. And to understand the journey and understand the sort of this wild sort of ride Bundini was on, you had to know where he came from and how those circumstances shaped him. After the Navy, he joins the Merchant Marines. After the Merchant Marines, he ends up in Harlem. And in so many ways, this is a book about history. He winds up in Harlem at a time which Harlem was becoming sort of a booming place for Black intellectual thought and expression. We had a lot of folks from the South coming north for this sort of this space in New York City that was Black owned. We had Black proprietors such as Sugar Ray Robinson, who was the most famous boxer at the time. And Sugar Ray had bought up an entire block of real estate. He had Sugar Ray's Golden Glove barbershop. He had a restaurant. He had a bar. He had all of these different, establishments in Harlem. At the time Bundini moved there, Sugar Ray had briefly retired. If you know anything about boxing, boxers like to retire, then come back. And Bundini winds up in Harlem with some of his Merchant Marine buddies. And he just happens to get an apartment above Sugar Ray Robinson's Golden Glove barbershop. As a result of that proximity, he befriends a lot of the boxers who show up at the barbershop to get their hair cut. One of those guys was Johnny Honeyboy Bratton, who was a former welterweight champion of the world. Bundini and Bratton become friends. And through that friendship, he meets the great Sugar Ray Robinson. And Sugar Ray is instantly taken by this guy. At that time, he was known as Fast Black. He was known as the Black Prince of Harlem. He hung out in all the jazz joints. He knew Miles Davis. He knew James Baldwin. He knew all these sort of upper crust Black intellectuals, and people in Harlem kind of knew who Fast Black was. So, Sugar Ray takes him in as essentially an errand boy. He even babysitted, he was a babysitter to Sugar Ray Robinson's kids for a period of time. So through that relationship, Sugar Ray eventually says, hey, if you really want to earn some money, I'm going to bring you to my training camp. Sugar Ray sort of comes out of retirement and as a middleweight. So he sets up this training camp in Greenwood Lake in upstate New York. And he invites Bundini to come to training camp to be sort of someone that helps out around the training camp. Bundini serves that apprenticeship for 7 straight years. And during that apprenticeship, learns a lot about boxing and learns a lot about what it means to be a fighter and what it means to go through a training camp. One of Bundini's famous poetic lines was, everyone sees, but only a few know. And Bundini in those 7 years working with the great Sugar Ray Robinson learned, what it takes, that behind the scenes stuff to be a great fighter. So through that relationship with Sugar Ray Robinson, fast forward to 1964, there's this young Olympian, this gold medalist out of Louisville, Kentucky. They called the Louisville Lip. His name was Cassius Clay, and he's making a splash in the heavyweight scene. And he fights his first headlining fight at Madison Square Garden, which is Sugar Ray's town. So Sugar Ray shows up to the weigh-in and the pre-fight festivities. And, Sugar Ray tells Muhammad Ali, or Cassius Clay at the time, I've got a guy who could really help you out, help you get your head on straight. This guy helps me in my training. He motivates me. He's like my personal motivator. And he's the only person I've ever met who can out-talk you. And he says, before the fight, I want you to meet this guy. I'm going to introduce you to him. And that's the time where Muhammad Ali meets Drew Bundini Brown for the very first time. So I wanted to read that story in the book as well. It's a little bit shorter than the first passage, but this one is about the first time Cassius Clay, who becomes Muhammad Ali, meets his lifelong buddy and trainer. And when I interviewed Ali's wife, I said, how would you compare their relationship? And she said they were Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. They were 2 ornery boys when they were around each other. So this is the first time Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer of boxing meet each other. This is the night before Ali's headlining fight in 1964 against Doug Jones. There was a knock at the door. Clay rose from the couch and answered it. Early in the week, when he arrived in New York City to promote the fight with Doug Jones, the controversial young challenger was given the opportunity to meet one of his boxing idols, Sugar Ray Robinson. I saw him on television reciting poetry in Greenwich Village. That was no way to train for a fight, Robinson reflected, recounting his meeting with Clay. I told Cassius he needed somebody to watch over him, somebody to keep him happy, someone to keep him relaxed. And I had just the guy for him, Robinson stated. Man, who are you talking about? Clay allegedly questioned. You need to see the Black Prince. All you need is some spiritual motivation, Robinson stated. Clay opened the door and was greeted by Bob Nelson, whom he affectionately referred to as Bobby. That's Sugar Ray Robinson's brother-in-law. You think you can talk, Cassius? Nelson joked upon entering the hotel room. You just hear this, man, he added, gesturing toward his accomplice, a tall, thin black man dressed in a tight red shirt and blue jeans. Clay looked in the stranger's eyes. He looked at his conk hairstyle, the long cigar dangling from his mouth. This is Drew Bundini Brown. We call him Fast Black, the Black Prince of Harlem, Nelson stated, introducing Clay to his spiritual motivator. Hey, man, Clay responded in his trademark Southern drawl. You can't predict no rounds, Bundini teased, his eyebrows drawn in a customary fashion. You're fixing them. You're fixing those fights. You're a phony, he added. You out of your mind, man, Clay responded, shocked by the visitor's tone of voice. You can't be predicting all them rounds, Bundini argued, his cigar moving up and down with each new accusatory remark. Tell the truth. You got together with all those fighters and you fixed them, didn't you? He implored. Clay did a double take, trying to figure out if Nelson was playing a prank on him. I'm no phony, Clay assured. Bundini's time in the streets of Harlem had taught him how to spot a con artist. Never in his tenure with Johnny Honeyboy Bratton or the great Sugar Ray Robinson had he ever heard of a fighter correctly predicting the round in which he knocked out his opponent. Bundini's strategy was to press the youngster, reading his facial expressions and body language when aggressively confronted. You got to be fixing those fights, or else you couldn't tell Archie Moore when he's going to be falling, Bundini argued, studying the young heavyweight's clean-shaven face. Clay, never a loss for words, continued his protest. This didn't stop Bundini. Either you're a phony or Shorty's in your corner, Bundini finally conceded, placing a pillow from the couch on the floor, seating himself on the pillow with his legs crossed Indian style. Tell me the truth, Bundini argued, puffing from the cigar. You want to know what the truth is? Clay finally responded, seating himself next to Bundini. The truth is, every time I go into the ring, I'm scared to death, Clay admitted. To this, Bundini flashed a look of pure shock. He expected bravado from the young, cocky heavyweight. Tears began to flow down Bundini's cheeks. By all indications, he was quick to cry, never one to mask or hide his emotions. And his son is the same way. I knew Shorty was with you. Shorty had to be with you, he cried, pulling Clay in for a hug and a kiss on the jaw. All that popping off and all that predicting, all the people wanting me to get whipped. I know I'm in trouble. If I lose, they'll run me out of this country, Clay admitted. I'm scared to death. That's the fact. Now you really know. No, you, me, and Shorty know, Bundini replied. The following night, Clay's prediction to knock out Doug Jones in 6. Clay won a unanimous decision, a close fight. His prediction didn't come true. The victory would do little to quell the critics who argued that Clay didn't have the stuff of champions. If you get that shot at Sonny Liston, you need me in your corner, Bundini told Clay in the locker room after the fight. Why do you want to be in my corner? Clay asked. Because you got the power and I got the spirit, Bundini argued. All right, you can be in my corner if you want to be, Clay answered. The title shot would have to wait. The razor-thin decision over Doug Jones led Clay's team to take a more cautious approach, opting instead for a tune-up fight before challenging Liston. 3 months later, Clay would travel to Wembley Stadium in London, England, to face the young heavyweight Henry Cooper. In the bout, Clay would once again flirt with disaster. A leaping left hook from Cooper would send Clay crumbling to the canvas at the close of the 4th round. Although Clay would recover, winning the bout being technical knockout the following round, the back-to-back difficult contest had exposed Clay's technical vulnerabilities, many critics argued. Very few, if any, boxing experts felt that Clay could last more than a few rounds against the menacing Sonny Liston. You're a heavyweight Sugar Ray. You'll beat Sonny Liston all right, Bundini said to Clay, phoning him after the Cooper fight. Am I in your corner? Bundini asked. Now, Ali does take on Bundini, and when he gets the shot at the unbeatable Sonny Liston, he brings Bundini down to Miami, Florida, where he trained, and Bundini replaces Ali's brother Rahman in the corner for the biggest fight of Ali's life. Ali pulls the upset. Bundini coins the phrase, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, and the rest is history. You know, Bundini was with Ali for 21 years. That trilogy with Joe Frazier, The Exile, when he refused to be inducted into the United States Army. This book kind of profiles those stories of that lifelong friendship between those two guys. And it tells Ali's story from Bundini's vantage point. You know, what a life he lived. Not only was he one of the most charismatic boxing trainers in the history of the sport, he was also a movie star. He was in those Shaft movies with Richard Roundtree. He played Willie, the gangster from Harlem. He was in The Color Purple, directed by Steven Spielberg, which featured Whoopi Goldberg, and Oprah was in that movie. He was in some B movies too, some sort of low-budget prison movies and boxing movies. He even played himself in Muhammad Ali's movie titled The Greatest. This book profiles that journey, and it profiles a lifelong friendship, that Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn friendship that Khalil Ali relayed to me. And really, it was one of the privileges of my life to write this story. As a kid who grew up the son of a boxing trainer who loved hip hop, it's really the honor of my writing career to get to tell Bundini's story and to get the opportunity to fill a research gap in hip hop history, because I think Bundini is a pre-hip hop icon. And I think Bundini is someone who's often forgotten by contemporary boxing fans. At the end of the day, I don't think this is a book about boxing. As you probably noticed from the opening excerpt, it's a book about fathers and sons. It's about friendship. It's about history. It's about race. It's about religion. And it's about the fight that is life, right? It's one of the reasons boxing books work so well, is that, life sort of is analogous to a fight, right? 2020 has definitely felt that way for all of us, I'm sure. So the slogan I'm going to leave you with is, who's your Bundini? Muhammad Ali was the greatest fighter to ever live. And if not Ali, Sugar Ray Robinson. But no one makes it on their own. And I certainly wouldn't be where I'm at in my life without a lot of great teachers, some great parents, my wife, and a lot of people who are close to me who sort of pick me up when I'm down. So the slogan we use to promote the book is, who's your Bundini? Was it a teacher, a friend, a spouse, a partner? We all have a Bundini in our life. And it doesn't mean we always want to hear what they have to say. Bundini would give the champ a lot of hard truths. As you could see in that excerpt, he wasn't sure Ali was really on the level, because he was predicting what rounds he would knock folks out, and then he would do it. But a Bundini is someone there, just like my dad's friend, Jeff Dean. He's the person who's there for you when you need him most. So I'll leave you with that slogan, who's your Bundini? And I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Bookwalter, who can field some questions from the folks who are watching the video on the live stream or on Zoom. Dr. Bookwalter, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Always a pleasure to hear you read from your book. Certainly gives us a flavor of what we can find there when we go pick up a copy and read through the whole thing. Let me just ask you, because I came across a documentary. I think it was Hamilcar that put the documentary together, and then you narrated it, and that's a very interesting piece of film about Bundini's life. How did that documentary come about? And are you the author? Are you the script writer for it?
Yeah, let me tell you how it came together. I mean, boxing folks love Bundini. He's a favorite for all of us who love Ali. We love that part of boxing history. But we knew, Hamilcar knew, that we had to reintroduce him to a new audience. And there were a lot of people who would really dig this book, but probably don't know who he is. So they hired Patrick Green, who's a filmmaker in LA, to put together the footage. We worked with Drew Brown III. I came in and did the narration, so I wrote my parts. My first time narrating a documentary, I don't know how well I did. I'm more comfortable as a writer and a teacher. But I think it's a 22-minute documentary. You can find it on YouTube, on Hamilcar's page, or just Google it. It pops right up. It's on my website as well. There's some great footage. We found some stuff that had never been released. Footage of Bundini talking about Ali and talking about his son. So we were excited to put the film out in conjunction with the book as a way to kind of reintroduce him to an audience that maybe didn't know who he was.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I'm curating all these questions, but in the chat, there's a question that's touched a little bit on that documentary, because I watched it. Were Bundini and Ali still close at the time of Bundini's death?
Yeah, one of the things the book does is it profiles the ups and downs of their relationships. Some folks I talked to said Ali fired him 8 times. Other people said 12 times. No, it was 15 times. Everyone gave me a different number. But what I picked up on is Bundini was fired a lot because he was not a yes man. He would tell the champ what he thought. And they disagreed. I mean, Bundini married a white Jewish woman named Rhoda Palestine. Bundini was a drinker. He liked to go out to the jazz clubs. Ali was a black Muslim who was the face of the Nation of Islam. They disagreed on a lot of issues. They were very different men in some ways. So they had their tiffs, they had their problems, but they would always bring Bundini back. And Ali's business manager said to me, sometimes Ali would fire him, then he would watch Ali train and he wasn't the same, and he would say, man, they would get nervous behind Ali's back and say, we need to bring Bundini back. So he said they would wait for Ali to be in a really good mood, and they would say, man, don't you think it's boring around here without Bundini? Let's give him a sec. What do you think, champ? Do you think we should give him another shot? And they would have to call and bring him back again. Yeah, they were friends all the way to the end, all the way to Bundini's tragic death in 1987. But they certainly had their tiffs, no doubt about it. It wasn't just a hallmark relationship.
That's good to know. Gail Brazeau writes, who was Bundini's Bundini?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. That's one of the best questions anyone's asked me, actually, Gail. Thank you for that. Bundini had this sort of nomadic spirit about him. I mean, he set off at 13 years old in the Navy and left his family behind in Sanford. And then he takes off to Philadelphia and then to Harlem. He was one of those guys who wherever you lay your hat is your home kind of guys. He really was someone who kind of only knew how to take care of himself. He was a good husband in some ways to Rhoda Palestine. He was a good father to his son. He loved his son. but he had never had a normal family life. He had never had that sort of, nuclear family structure. I'm not sure Bundini had a Bundini. He was guided by Shorty, he said, and I've read a lot of his personal writings. He had a personal relationship with Shorty, which was his name for the higher power. And he was the ultimate optimist that no matter what happened, even if things were bad, they were bad for a reason. Shorty wanted it to be that way. Shorty didn't make mistakes. So in some ways, you could see why that would be a nice guy to have in your corner if you're a boxer. See, Ali breaks his jaw in the first fight with Ken Norton. Bundini comes to the hospital the next day and says, "Champ, think. Shorty made this happen. Because otherwise, nobody would have ever doubted you. Now you can shock the world again. You're going to come back and be bigger than ever because of this broken jaw." And of course, Ali wins the rematch, and Bundini's right. He does come back bigger than ever. But, I'm not sure Bundini had a Bundini. I think Bundini was guided by his own sort of free nomadic spirit and this idea of, a God who would make it right in the end.
All right. And Andrew Gooding asks, how does a boxing trainer balance building a fighter up when they're scared to death, but making sure the fighter prepares sufficiently and is careful?
It's a wonderful question. The first lesson he taught Ali when he came to the Liston training camp was that fear is your friend. Fear is a fire. And that, to be afraid and be man enough to cry, to be man enough to say, "I'm afraid," or "I doubt myself," that's what a real champ does. He said that's what Sugar Ray Robinson taught him. That a real fighter can be scared and still function. A real fighter can be scared and still train hard and still operate, even though he knows that fear and doubt's there. He's going to do the right thing anyways. A lot of great boxing trainers are psychologists. The great Customato used to tell Tyson, fear is it's a flame. If you fan it, it can become a roaring blaze. And fear is nothing to worry about. Every man fears. But the difference between a hero and a coward is what one does despite fear. And that was very much the rhetoric Bundini gave to Ali when he was a massive underdog against Sonny Liston, who was sort of the Mike Tyson of his day, this sort of gangster street guy,
Wow. Okay. Michelle Schiavone, do you think Bundini's father's alcoholism and abuse is what helped him deal with Ali as such when Ali would yell at Bundini and smack him in the face?
Yeah, it was one of the things that was hard to talk about with his son. But Ali he didn't just do it to Bundini, by the way, but he would smack Bundini sometimes if they were disagreeing over something. Mm-hmm. And I do think Bundini's childhood unlocked a lot of mysteries for me. His dad was very abusive. His dad was an alcoholic. Alcoholism runs in the Brown family pretty deep. It's something that a lot of the men in the family have had to fight and deal with. A lot of his demons came from that feeling of abandonment from his mother. His father beat up his mother quite a bit, and his mother took off one day and didn't come back and left him with his father. And that did a lot for his trust issues with people too. And I think he became a loner. He didn't want to have to depend on anyone, only to depend on himself. So I think his background explains him in a lot of ways, Michelle. I don't think it's just the fact that Ali dished out some verbal and physical abuse and he took it because he had sort of grown up in that environment. I think that's a component of it. One thing that I did hear from people is that Bundini would cuss Ali out. Tim Witherspoon, a former heavyweight champion, said, "I couldn't believe it. He was cussing out the greatest fighter ever. I'm thinking he could destroy you if he wanted to." And he said Bundini would cuss him out at the drop of a hat. And they had this weird dynamic in their friendship where Bundini may have been the only person who was close to Ali who wasn't afraid to say what they thought. He was a little bit of reality for Ali. So think about this. Ali was so famous that everyone laughed at his jokes. He was the most handsome, most beautiful, most perfect everything. His nickname was the greatest. Bundini was the only person really in that entourage who was willing to say, not all the time, champ. And I think it's one of the reasons Ali kept bringing him back. He needed that little touch of reality, even if it was a hard pill to swallow sometimes.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly interesting in that passage that you read about their meeting. That is,
It starts really out that way.
Contrary to what we think about Ali, we think about Ali being kind of a bragging a person, yeah, and not to openly admit fear.
Yeah, about all boxers feel that. And I learned that as a boxer, and I learned it from my dad. They fear just like everybody else. Right.
That would probably be a little foolish not to be afraid of what could happen. But
you're fighting Big George Foreman. That's certainly something to be afraid of. He was a massive dude.
Well, it looks like we've used up the hour that we set aside for this, and I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap, but
Great.
I don't mean wrap, right? But
Rap like Bundini did.
wrap up the event, and really do appreciate your time and reading and some of the insights into how the book came about and some of the great stories. I can't wait to read the whole book, and appreciate everything you've been doing, Todd.
Well, I appreciate Marshall University giving me this platform. Even more than promoting the book or spreading the word about the book, I would like first generation college students like myself who are in your classrooms right now to see that they can do it too. It took me a couple books, but this is my first international book that's outside the US and all over the world. And I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Marshall University. So I hope the kids who were there know that, if I can do it, they can, because I certainly am nothing special. So, thank you for giving me the platform for that reason.
Yeah, well, you are special in your own way, right? I mean, and we're happy to have been to play some of that Bundini part for you. Yeah. And a lot of times what I say to our alumni who are doing great things like you've been doing, you're making us look good. So
thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
I appreciate you guys. Good night, everyone who's watching. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.